Well, hello guys, and welcome back to the YouTube and welcome back to the channel. And once again today we are in the fabulous Mevagissey. Narrow streets and terrace houses lead down to the centre of the old Mevagissey, where the distinctive twin harbour provides a safe haven for the many fishing boats that land their daily catch here. But did you know the interesting and colourful history of Mevagissey's past? Today we take you back in time to explore how Mevagissey was founded, from smuggling to pilchards to today's buzzing fishing ports. Mevagissey, or commonly known as Meva by the locals, was born and raised on fishing. The village would have originally been settled for its sheltered cove, just a short distance away from deep water. Since those early settlers, Mevagissey's history has been a tale of an uncommonly resilient village that dozens of tough generations have kept alive through war, disease, international famine, hunger, and a few bottles of smuggled cognac here and there. The history of Mevagissey as a significant human inhabitation begins long before the location had a name we would recognise. Settlers who had travelled west across the Mediterranean from northwestern Italy found favour in a valley during the Bronze Age and decided to occupy the area. Marseilles, a Greek merchant, explored Cornwall in the late Bronze Age and described the inhabitants as skilled wheat farmers, usually peaceable but formidable in the war, where they used horse-drawn chariots. He also described the Cornish trade in tin with the Mediterranean. The traces of the Bronze Age around Mevagissey are sparse, but their burial mounds can still be seen on the cliffs to the south of the village, and the hill fort ruins on Camp Hill remind us of their presence at this time. There was access by road to the Bronze Age part of Persil, and when the Romans arrived at approximately the time of Jesus, they established a fort called Cornish, using the old Bronze Age tracks. In the first centuries after the Romans left Cornwall in the 5th century, the age of antiquity faded out and the Middle Ages began. For Cornwall and Mevagissey, this meant Celtic traditions and a new wave of Christianity. A time had become known as the Age of the Saints. Mevagissey had two distinct settlements, Lamerick and Porthilly, a fishing community. A saint from Ireland called Mevin arrived in the 6th century, with recruits including Saint Izzy from Brittany to convert the Cornish. In memory of those two saints, a church united the two settlements and the village became known Mevagissey and eventually Mevagissey. For a long time, the most powerful priests and landowners were Cornish. Up until 875, Cornwall had its own king, though he may have been an under-king, as we know the King of Wessex went hunting in Cornwall at this time. King Donyath, the last Cornish king, supposedly drowned or was decapitated and had his head thrown into the River Foy. At the beginning of the first millennium, the Viking king, Swen Forkbeard, conquered Wessex, but allowed Cornwall, Scotland and Wales to self-rule in exchange for making payments to the king. When he lost power, so did Cornwall, and not much later the Norman aristocracy carved out the land. After Norman invasions, the Domesday survey of 1086-88 informs us that Mevagissey was split into 4 manors: Porthilly, Treleaven, Bodrugan and Penwan. In this time, there was strong trading links to mainland Europe, which were lost in the 100-Year War, but re-established after it ended. During that time, the first stone harbour was built. The people of Mevagissey have always had a strong dependency on the fishing industry, meaning that ecological changes and political restrictions on trade heavily impacted the community. I love walking around the harbour here at Mevagissey. It gives you a real insight and feeling of how the fishing industry works here in Cornwall, and it's a really interesting place to visit. 2 years after the end of the 100-Year War, the War of Roses began. Most families around Mevagissey were not actively involved, but Sir Henry Bodrugan of Bodrugan Castle kept his own private army and supported the House of York. His ship used to sail from Mevagissey and seize Dutch, Spanish and French vessels. And indeed, he made armed raids of his neighbours, who supported the Lancastrian cause, stealing women, various goods and cattle. When Bodrugan supported Richard III, who was defeated, Henry VII accused Bodrugan of treason. But Bodrugan was safe within the walls of his heavily fortified castle. Supporting Lambert Smeenel, the Pretender, was a step too far for Henry VII, and in turn he issued Bodrugan's death warrant. Bodrugan had made plenty of powerful enemies, and a local force, likely comprised of some of the men of Mevagissey, arrived at his castle to execute him. As the soldiers arrived, Sir Henry supposedly fled, leapt from a cliff and swam to an escape boat. and that boat was to take him to Ireland, far away where he owned land. The title of Baron was stripped from his family after his death, and his castle was destroyed, and Mevagissey became a more peaceful place for that century. By 1640, Mevagissey had a flourishing fishing fleet. These caught pilchard in summer, herring in winter, and mackerel in spring. The industry was thriving, but would have experienced a lull in the Civil War when the men of Mevagissey had a fight against one another. In 1733, fishing was no longer turned to as a sole means of putting bread on the table. Smuggling was rife. The port of Roscoff was the primary stop where French cognac, Dutch gin, tea, tobacco, silks and lace would be picked up and brought back and sold at high prices. However, when John Wesley came in 1750, the Methodist preacher had a radical impact on the people of Mevagissey, and some stopped smuggling. One man had made £3,000 on his last trip, a sum equivalent to £180,000 in today's money, and he decided to quit because he could not reconcile smuggling with Methodism. In 1775 there was a successful application for a new harbour at Mevagissey, and indeed in 1866 it was enlarged. And around this time there was also a cholera outbreak, which ended up killing many locals. People moved out of Mevagissey around this time to places with much cleaner water sources. However, the problem was solved in part by the locals boiling water to make tea. Now, over the 19th century, fishing changed in Mevagissey. Drift fishing was found to be much more effective, and pilchards were caught in their plenty. And it is thought that overfishing is the cause for the pilchard stocks to be decimated. Mevagissey was badly affected by the Great Blizzard of 1888. Farmers found cows frozen solid in their fields. Mevagissey was completely cut off and houses buried in snow. In 1914 to 18, German boats came in close to torpedo merchantmen and sometimes fishermen in both world wars. Fit young men left to fight, leaving only boys and old men to fish, damaging the industry. But today, the fishing industry is still very much alive and active, and Mevagissey is unique in that it is managing to grab the attention of the younger generations who are still actively fishing from the shores. You might say the history of Mevagissey is built upon pile after pile of fish. Over 23 species of fish are targeted out of Mevagissey, as well as lobster and spider crab. The founding and growth of Mevagissey has always been centred around fish and the sea. However, towards the end of the 19th century, Mevagissey was recognised by Parliament for its significant involvement in trading tin, wine, tobacco, stone, cider, ropes, hemp, flour and other goods. It's for good reason that the word most associated with Mevagissey's history is pilchard. This one catch was what led to the dramatic growth in industry, mostly from selling the oily fish to Europeans, who craved pilchard far more than the British. Oil from pilchards was also used in street lamps in London. In the early 20th century, approximately 75 million pilchard were exported annually. The pilchard shoals were so large that killer whales, called grampus by the locals, were occasionally spotted venturing into Cornish waters for a good feed, a sight unheard of in recent times. Mevagissey has numerous secret passages, trapdoors and creative ways of getting through the village unseen to support Mevagissey's underground industry, smuggling. Today, Mevagissey's fishing industry is alive and still producing fish from international shipping. A common difficulty for fishing villages is a lack of young people filling in roles as the older generation retire. But Mevagissey doesn't have this problem, and there are lots of young people entering the industry. The charm of the village and its close proximity to the lost gardens of Heligan and other attractions makes it popular with tourists, which has become the dominant industry in Mevagissey. Now, since the year 2000, there's been a large amount of improvements and changes to the harbour here at Mevagissey, with the opening of an aquarium at the old lifeboat station, a new slip built at Gurnard's Quay, additional lofts built, a jetty extension, extra cranage put in, new ice plants, and a grid built for boats to sit on whilst being repaired. In addition to the general maintenance and upkeep of the harbour, significant work was undertaken to strengthen the North Pier foundations and to stabilise the cliffs alongside the South Pier. Historically, until the 1960s, fish landings were handled by private merchants, after which a fishermen's cooperative took over. However, this folded with no private firm willing to take over the harbour. The harbour trustees took responsibility for the running of the West Quay facility, but not the marketing of the catch, which is the responsibility of the individual fishermen. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you found this video on Cornish history and Mevagissey useful and informative. And here's to many more. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.